The Satanic Mill by Otfried Preussler. The first year, 8. Remember, I am the master. The master had fixed a yoke outside the open door of the house. Both ends were nailed to the door frame at shoulder height. As the men came back, they had to pass under it, one by one saying, I bow beneath the yoke of the secret brotherhood. The master was waiting for them in the hall, and he gave each man a blow on the right cheek with the words, Remember, you are my pupil. Then he struck them on the left cheek, adding, Remember, I am the master. After that, the men had to bow low to the miller 3 times, promising, I will obey you in all things, master, now and forever. Tonda and Crabbit met with the same reception. The boy did not yet realize that he was now the master's property, delivered up to him utterly body and soul for life and death. He joined the other men who were standing at the end of the passage, as if they were waiting for their breakfast. They all had the sign of the pentagram drawn on their foreheads, like Tonda and Crabbit himself. Petar and Leishko were not back yet, but they soon appeared at the door too, and after they had bowed under the yoke, taken their blows on the cheeks, and made their promises, the mill began to go round. To work! Cried the master to his men. Off with you! At that, the miller's men threw off their coats. They ran to the grinding room, rolling up their sleeves as they went, dragged up sacks of grain and set to work, while the master kept them, hard at it, shouting and gesticulating impatiently. And this is supposed to be Easter Sunday, thought Crabbit. Not a wink of sleep all night, no breakfast, and we have to work twice as hard as usual. Even Tonda ran out of breath at last and began to sweat. They were all sweating freely that morning. The perspiration dripped from their foreheads and temples, ran down their necks, poured down their backs so that their shirts were sticking to them. How much longer is this going on? Crabbit wondered. Wherever he looked, he saw set, grim faces. They were all grunting and groaning, hot and damp with perspiration as they were, and the pentagrams on their foreheads were blurring, dissolving in their sweat and gradually disappearing. Then something quite unexpected happened. Crabbit, shouldering a stack of wheat, was struggling up the steps to the bin floor. It took the very last of his strength and every scrap of willpower he had. He was just about to stumble and collapse under his burden when suddenly all his troubles were over. The pain in his legs was gone, his backache had disappeared, and his breathing came easily. Tonda, he cried, look at this! He was up on the bin floor with one bound. Then, tipping the sack off his shoulder, he grabbed it by both ends, and before emptying it into the hopper, he brandished it in the air with shouts of triumph, as easily as if it were full of feathers instead of grain. It was as if the miller's men had been transformed by magic. They stretched their arms, laughed, and slapped their thighs. Even the sour-faced Quito was no exception. Crabbit was hurrying off to the granary to fetch the next sack, but the head journeyman cried, Stop, that'll do. They let the wheat run through the mill, and then Tonda stopped the machinery. That's it for today, he said. With a final creak and clatter, the mill wheel ran down, and they knocked the flour out of the meal bins. And now to make merry, brothers, shouted Stashko. All of a sudden, there were big pitchers of wine, and Jura was bringing in dishes of Easter cakes, sweet and golden brown, fried in lard and filled with curds or plum jam. Fall to, brothers, eat them up, and don't forget the wine. They ate and drank and made merry, and later Androsh began to sing loud and boisterously. They washed down their cakes with red wine, and then formed a circle, linked arms, and stamped their feet in time to the song. The miller he sits at the mill house door, clack, clackety, clickety, clack. Spies as fine a young fellow as ever you saw, clickety, clackety, clickety. As ever you saw, clackety, clickety, clack. The miller's men sang the clackety, clickety in chorus. Then Hanzo started the next verse, and so they went on singing in turn and dancing in a ring, first to the right and then to the left, into the middle and out again. Crabbit's turn came at last, since he was only the apprentice. He shut his eyes and sang the last verse of the song. This fine young fellow, no fool was he. Clackety, clickety, clack. He struck the miller down on his knee. Clackety, clickety. Down on his knee. Clackety, clickety, clack. He stopped dancing and fell to drinking again. Kubo, who was usually so quiet, took the boy aside and patted him on the back. You have a good voice, Crabbit. You ought to be singing in a choir, said he. Who, me? Asked Crabbit. It was only now Kubo mentioned it that he realized he could sing again in a deeper voice than before, to be sure, but a voice that was firm and clear. The rasp in his throat that had been bothering him since the beginning of last winter was quite gone. On Easter Monday, the miller's men went back to work as usual. Everything was back to normal, except that Crabbit no longer had to toil so hard. He could easily do whatever the master told him now. It seemed that the days when he dropped on his bed half dead with exhaustion every evening were gone forever. Crabbit was heartily thankful for it, and he could guess how it had happened. When he and Tonda were next alone together, he asked his friend. "Yes, you're right," said Tonda. "As long as we carry the sign of the pentagram on our foreheads, we have to work like slaves until the moment when the last of us is washed away in the sweat of his brow. In return, our work will be easy all the year, as long as we do it between dawn and dusk." "What about other times?" asked Crabbit. "After dark, I mean." "Not then," said Tonda. "We have to manage as best we can after dark. But set your mind to rest, Crabbit. For one thing, we don't have to leave our beds to work so very often, and for another, well, it's bearable when it happens." They never mentioned the night before Easter again, or Tonda's grief for the girl he loved. They did not even allude to it, yet Crabbit thought he knew where Tonda had been while he sat by the fire like a dead man staring into the distance. And whenever Crabbit thought of Vorshula and her story, the singer of Schwarzkolm, the girl who led the choir, came into his mind, or rather her voice, as he had heard it, floating across the fields from the village at midnight. This seemed strange to him. He would have liked to forget that voice, yet he found it was impossible. Once a week, on Fridays, the miller's men assembled outside the black room after supper, turned themselves into ravens. Crabbit soon learned the trick of it, and settled on their perch. Every Friday the master read them a passage from the Book of Necromancy. He read it 3 times in all, and they had to repeat it after him, though the master himself did not care what or how much of it they remembered. Crabbit was eager to memorize all the master taught them. Storm spells and charms to make hail, the casting of magic bullets, and the way to use them, invisibility, the art of going out of one's body, and many other things. While he was working by day and before he fell asleep at night, he repeated the instructions and the words of the spells from the book over and over again, so as to stamp them on his memory. For by now, Crabbit had realized one thing. A man who knew the art of arts had power over other men, and to have power as much as the master had, if not more, struck him as a fine thing to aim for. It was to achieve that aim that he was studying and studying and studying. One night, in the 2nd week after Easter, the miller's men were called from their beds. The master was standing at the attic door with a light in his hand. "There is work to be done," he cried. "The good man is coming. Hurry up and make haste." In the rush, Crabbit could not find his shoes, so he followed the others out of the mill barefoot. There was a new moon. The night was so dark that the miller's men could not see an inch in front of them. In the crush, someone wearing wooden clogs trod on Crabbit's toes. "Hey!" cried the boy. "Watch out, you clumsy oaf!" A hand was put over his mouth. "Shh!" Tonda whispered. Then Crabbit realized that not one of the miller's men had spoken a word since the master woke them, and they did not utter a sound all the rest of the night, nor did Crabbit himself. He could guess what kind of work lay ahead, and soon enough the stranger with the flickering plume in his hat came rattling up in his cart. The men fell upon it, tore off the dark canvas cover, and began dragging sacks into the mill to the dead stones at the far end of the grinding room. Everything happened just as it had 4 weeks ago when Crabbit watched the others through the gable window, only this time the master swung himself up by the stranger's side on the box. Today it was he who cracked the whip right above their heads, so that the men ducked as they felt it whistle past. Crabbit had almost forgotten what hard work it was to carry a full sack, and how soon you were out of breath. "Remember that you are my pupil!" Those were the master's words, and the longer Crabbit thought about them, the less he liked the sound of them. The whip cracked, the men ran back and forth, the mill wheel went around, and the house was filled with the clatter and squeal of the dead stones. What was in those sacks? Crabbit glanced into the hopper, but he could not make out much in the dim light of the lantern swaying from the ceiling. Was he tipping clods of dirt, or pine cones into the hopper, or maybe round stones encrusted with mud? The boy had no time to take a closer look. Leishko came up with the next sack, panting, and elbowed Crabbit's side. Michael and Merton had taken up their positions by the meal bin. They refilled the empty sacks with whatever it was that had been ground and tied them up. Again, everything just as before. At first cock crow, the cart was loaded up again. The cover pulled over it and fastened. The stranger reached for his whip, and off he went with his cart, so fast that the master only just had time to jump down without breaking his neck. "Come with me," said Tonda to Crabbit. Well, the others went into the house. The two of them went up to the mill race to shut the sluice. They heard the mill wheel run down below them, and all was quiet, but for the rooster crowing and the hens clucking. Does he often come?" asked Crabbit, jerking his head in the direction in which the cart had disappeared into the morning mist. "Every night of the new moon," said Tonda. "Do you know who he is?" "Only the master knows that. He calls him the good man, and he is afraid of him." They walked slowly back to the mill through the dewy meadows. There's one thing I don't understand," said Crabbit, before they entered the house. "Last time the stranger came, the master was working too. Why not today?" "Last time he had to help us to make up the dozen," said the head journeyman, "but since Easter the numbers of the Black School have been made up. So now he can afford to spend the nights of the new moon cracking the whip." And that is the end of chapter 8.